aware of how these heuristics can cause us to make wrong choices, we can take steps to counteract them. Psychologists have identified several conditions under which we are more likely to rely on heuristics rather than rational decision-making. 90. When we don't have time to think carefully about an issue. When we are so overloaded with information that it becomes impossible to process the information fully. When the issues at stake are not very important to us. When we lack the required knowledge for making a reasoned decision, and when we let our emotions and wishful thinking get in the way. Mental time travel, biases in predicting the future and recalling the past. Sometimes it seems that human beings spend half their time thinking about the past and the other half imagining the future. Either way, we make mistakes. Constructive prediction, predicting how certain outcomes will make us feel, determines the goals we set and the risks we are willing to take. Indeed, whenever we seek to get something, we are essentially making a bet that getting it will make us happy, or at least happier. Yet we often make predictions about ourselves that are dead wrong. 91. We overestimate the emotional impact of future events and how long our reactions will last, whether the events are positive or negative. In one study, college students were asked how happy or unhappy they imagined they would feel after being randomly assigned to live in a dorm they thought was desirable or undesirable. The students predicted that their dorm assignments would have a huge impact on their overall level of happiness and that being assigned to an undesirable dorm would essentially wreck their satisfaction for the whole year. In fact, 1 year later, everyone had nearly identical levels of happiness no matter where they were living. Perhaps the undesirable dorms turned out, unexpectedly, to have cool people living in them? No. The students had focused on the wrong factors when forecasting their future feelings of happiness. They had placed far more importance on what the dorm looked like and on its location than on its inhabitants. But, in fact, it's people who make a place fun or unpleasant to live in, and all of the dorms had likable people in them. Because the students could not foresee this, or how much they would like their new dorm mates, they mispredicted their future happiness. 92. Why do we mispredict? One reason is that we adjust to both happy and sad events in our lives, but we fail to recognize our powers of adjustment when we mentally construct what our futures will look and feel like. Another reason is that when we imagine the future, we tend to focus only upon the event in question and fail to consider all the other things that will undoubtedly occur at the same time to take the sting out of failure or to dilute our happiness. So we imagine that marriage, winning the lottery, or becoming famous will keep us giddy with happiness for a long time, or that losing a job or being jilted will devastate us forever, despite the fact that the pleasure or pain these events bring will fade with time. Our inability to forecast the future can cause trouble, especially when we make plans way in advance. What was I thinking when I thought it would be a good idea to take 3 science classes in the same semester? I'm drowning in work here. When viewed from today, the future looks different from the present, in much the same way that objects look smaller from a distance. We imagine the future at an abstract level, and we are more concerned with how desirable our prediction is than with how feasible it is. From a distance, you might think it sounds like a great idea to take 3 science classes in the same semester and get a big jump ahead on your major, but you are probably not thinking of how hard that might be, logistically and pragmatically. In a study conducted by Mira Lieberman and Yakov Trop, 93 students were more likely to make a decision about whether or not to attend a concert based on how much they thought they would enjoy the concert rather than on how feasible attending the concert would be. This disregard for feasibility leads to ineffectual planning. When you make plans, you can save yourself a lot of grief if you are mindful of the human tendency to construe the future as rosier than the present. Reconstructive memory people love to believe that memories are accurately embedded or buried somewhere in the mind and can be recalled through drugs or hypnosis. Unfortunately, there's no exact recording of past events in our memories that we can access with a rewind button, nor, to use that incorrect computer metaphor, are they digitally encoded. On the contrary, remembering is a reconstructive process. Our memories are most strongly influenced not by what actually happened in the past but by what we are thinking about those events in the present. We recreate our memories from bits and pieces of actual events filtered through and modified by our notions of what might have been, what should have been, or the way we would like things to have been. Our memories are undergoing constant revision, and they are influenced by what other people tell us about the past event, by photos, and by hearsay. Elizabeth Loftus, a prominent cognitive psychologist, has conducted a fascinating program of research on reconstructive memory, 94, investigating how suggestive questioning, with the most subtle of words, can influence memory and subsequent eyewitness testimony. In one of her experiments, 95, Loftus showed people a film depicting a multiple-car accident. After the film, some were asked about how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. Others were asked the same question, but the word smashed was replaced by the word hit. Those who were asked about smashing cars, as opposed to hitting cars, estimated that the cars were going significantly faster. Moreover, a week after seeing the film, they were more likely to state, erroneously, that there was broken glass at the accident scene. In another study, Loftus showed students a series of slides depicting an accident involving an automobile and a pedestrian. 96 In a critical slide, a green car was shown driving past the accident. Immediately after viewing the slides, half of the students were asked, did the blue car that drove past the accident have a ski rack on the roof? The other half were asked this same question but with the word blue deleted. Those who were asked about the blue car were more likely to claim incorrectly that they had seen a blue car. A simple word change in the question had altered their memories. Autobiographical memory is not only reconstructive when it involves quick, snapshot-like events, such as the details of an automobile accident, but also when it involves something more enduring, such as our own history. Major distortions occur over time, and these revisions of autobiographical memory are not random. Rather, we construct memories to fit the picture we have of ourselves. Thanks to the confirmation bias, we are more likely to recall memories that confirm our belief. For example, when people have a narrative of their childhoods as having been unhappy, any events that violate that picture will be more difficult to recall than events that support it. If they have good relationships with their parents now, their childhood memories will be sweeter than they felt at the time. Over the years, as people seek out memories that confirm their current beliefs about their parents and reject and forget those that don't fit, their memories become increasingly coherent and less accurate. In this manner, all of us rewrite our personal histories. It is not necessarily that we are lying about our past, it is simply that we misremember in a way that fits with our schemas. 97. Elizabeth Loftus has carried this line of research a step further. She has shown that it is possible, indeed, relatively easy, to plant false memories of childhood experiences in the minds of young adults merely by having a close relative talk about these events as fact. 98. For example, if a young man's older sister said to him, "Remember the time when you were 5 years old and you got lost for several hours at the University City shopping mall? And you went into a panic, and an old man tried to help you? When we discovered you, you were holding the old man's hand and crying." Within a few days of hearing such a story, most people will have incorporated that planted false memory into their own history, will have embroidered it with details, and will be absolutely certain that it happened, when, in fact, it didn't. One of the striking findings in this research is how the affect heuristic can be immensely misleading when it comes to memories. People can feel absolutely confident that planted memories are real, and be absolutely wrong. In study after study, confidence in a memory turns out to be a poor guide to its authenticity. 99. I find one aspect of autobiographical memory is especially useful to students. Recall the discussion of the egocentric bias? There's a lesson in here for you. One of the best ways to recall material from this book is to relate it to your personal experiences, to think how it applies to you. Living with the cognitive miser within. I don't want you to come away from reading this chapter with the impression that human beings are wholly and hopelessly irrational. The take-home message is that we are born with the ability to be both irrational and rational, and that even our biases can be adaptive. Being a cognitive miser brings us an array of benefits, but these benefits come with a price tag, a somewhat distorted picture of yourself and the world. As long as sticking with our initial way of seeing things and making decisions doesn't get us into big trouble, our cognitive miserliness can get us through the day with maximum efficiency and minimal effort. Steve Jobs, the legendary founder of Apple, was said to have had a reality distortion field that enabled him to see and remember things as he wished, including a faith in his ability to make insanely great products that people would stand in line for. 100. Without his optimism, combined with creativity and relentless perfectionism, Apple might have folded before developing the iPhone, which made Apple the world's most valuable company. But the same reality distortion field that kept Jobs innovating also led him to delay medical treatment for his pancreatic cancer, which was diagnosed at an early, treatable stage. He believed that he could cure it with a vegan diet. He could not. For me personally, one of the most fascinating aspects of the social animal is the need to see ourselves as good, smart, and sensible people, and to observe how this need frequently leads us to do things and adopt beliefs that are neither good nor smart nor sensible. The human tendency for self-justification is so important and multifaceted that it deserves a chapter all to itself. I turn to that chapter now. 3. Self-justification. Saul Steinberg, Untitled Drawing, Ink on Paper. Originally published in The New Yorker, February 16, 1963. Picture the following scene: a young man named Sam is being hypnotized. The hypnotist gives Sam a post-hypnotic suggestion, telling him that, when the clock strikes 4 o'clock, he will go to the closet, get his raincoat and galoshes, and put them on, grab an umbrella, walk 8 blocks to the supermarket and purchase 6 bottles of bourbon, and return home. Sam is told that, as soon as he re-enters his apartment, he will snap out of it and be himself again. When the clock strikes 4 o'clock, Sam immediately heads for the closet, dons his raincoat and galoshes, grabs his umbrella, and trudges out the door on his quest for bourbon. There are a few strange things about this errand. It is a sunshiny day without a cloud in the sky. There is a liquor store half a block away that sells bourbon for the same price as the supermarket 8 blocks away, and Sam doesn't drink. Sam arrives home, opens the door, re-enters his apartment, snaps out of his trance, and discovers himself standing there in his raincoat and galoshes, with his umbrella in one hand and a huge sack of liquor bottles in the other. He looks momentarily confused. His friend, the hypnotist, says, "Hey, Sam, where have you been?" "Oh, just down to the store," Sam says. "What did you buy?" It seems I bought this bourbon." "But you don't drink, do you?" "No, but I'm going to do a lot of entertaining during the next several weeks, and some of my friends do." "How come you're wearing all that rain gear on such a sunny day?" "Well, actually, the weather is quite changeable this time of year, and I didn't want to take any chances." "But there isn't a cloud in the sky." "Well, you never can tell." "By the way, where did you buy the liquor?" "Oh, well, down at the supermarket." "How come you went that far?" "Well, it was such a nice day, I thought it might be fun to take a long walk." People are motivated to justify their own actions, beliefs, and feelings. When they do something, they will try, if at all possible, to convince themselves that it was a logical, reasonable thing to do. There was a good reason that Sam did those silly things: he was hypnotized. But because Sam was unaware of the post-hypnotic instructions and because it was difficult for him to accept the fact that he was capable of behaving in a nonsensical manner, he went to great lengths to convince himself that there was a method to his madness, that his actions were perfectly sensible. As we saw in Chapter 2, much of our behavior is governed by factors of which we are unaware. Then, when pressed to explain our actions, we attempt to construct a story that makes sense but at the same time satisfies our desire to look good to ourselves and to others. That's the essence of self-justification. Self-justification. The tendency to justify one's actions in order to maintain one's self-esteem. Let's say you are in the midst of a natural disaster, such as an earthquake. All around you, buildings are toppling and people are getting injured and killed. You're scared. Do you need to seek a reason or justification for your fear? Certainly not. The evidence is all around you. the injured people and the devastated buildings are ample explanations for your fear. But suppose the earthquake occurred in a neighboring town. You felt the tremors, and you're hearing stories of the damage that occurred there. You are frightened, but you are not in the midst of the devastated area. Neither you nor the people around you have been hurt, and no buildings in your town have been damaged. Would you need additional reasons to explain why you are nonetheless scared? Yes. Much like our hypnotized friend in the raincoat and galoshes, you would be motivated to make sense of your feelings. Because you see nothing to be afraid of in the immediate vicinity, you would be inclined to generate reasons for being scared out of your wits. This example is not hypothetical, it actually occurred in India. In the aftermath of an earthquake, investigators collected and analyzed the rumors being spread among those living where the earthquake had hit and those living nearby. What they discovered was startling. Jamuna Prasad, an Indian psychologist, found that people living in the neighboring villages away from the epicenter, that is, those who could feel the tremors but were not in imminent danger, began spreading rumors of impending doom. A flood was rushing toward them. February 26 would be a day of deluge and destruction. Another severe earthquake would erupt on the day of the lunar eclipse, a cyclone would strike within a few days, and other unforeseeable calamities were on the horizon. Why in the world would people invent, believe, and communicate such stories? Were these people masochists? Were they paranoid? Clearly, spreading rumors about coming disasters would not encourage people to feel calm and secure. One explanation is that the people were terribly frightened, but because they lacked ample justification for this fear, they invented their own, which spared them feeling foolish. After all, if a cyclone is on the way, isn't it perfectly reasonable that I should be wild-eyed with fear? This explanation was bolstered by Durganand Sinha's study of rumors. Sinha investigated the rumors spread in an Indian village in the wake of a disaster of similar magnitude. The major difference between the situation in Prasad's study and the one in Sinha's study was that the people studied by Sinha had directly experienced the destruction and witnessed the damage. They were scared, but they had good reasons to be. They had no need to seek additional justification for their fears. Thus, their rumors contained no prediction of impending disaster and no serious exaggeration. Indeed, if anything, the rumors were comforting, such as one that predicted that the water supply would be restored in a short time. The theory of cognitive dissonance. Inspired by these findings, Leon Festinger developed a powerful theory of human motivation that he called the theory of cognitive dissonance. It is a remarkably simple theory but, as we shall see, the range of its application is enormous. Festinger described cognitive dissonance as a state of tension that occurs when an individual simultaneously holds two cognitions that are psychologically inconsistent. Two cognitions are dissonant if the opposite of one follows from the other. Because the experience of cognitive dissonance is unpleasant, people are motivated to reduce it. This is analogous to the processes involved in reducing such drives as hunger or thirst, except that, here, the driving force arises from cognitive discomfort rather than physiological need. To hold two ideas that contradict each other is to flirt with absurdity, and as the existentialist philosopher Albert Camus observed, humans are creatures who spend their lives trying to convince themselves that their existence is not absurd. Cognitive dissonance. A state of tension that occurs whenever an individual simultaneously holds two cognitions that are psychologically inconsistent. How do we convince ourselves that our lives are not absurd? That is, how do we reduce cognitive dissonance? We do this by changing one or both cognitions in such a way as to render them more compatible with each other or by adding more cognitions that help bridge the gap between the original cognitions. Let me give you an example that is, alas, all too familiar to many people. Suppose a person loves to smoke cigarettes and then sees an anti-smoking message. The smoker experiences dissonance. The cognition, I smoke cigarettes, is dissonant with the cognition, cigarette smoking is a major cause of lung cancer and is unhealthy for many other reasons. The smartest and most efficient way for this person to reduce dissonance is to give up smoking. The cognition, cigarette smoking causes cancer, is consonant with the cognition, I do not smoke. But for most people it is not easy to give up smoking. Imagine Sally, a longtime smoker. What will she do to reduce dissonance? In all probability, she will try to work on the other cognition: cigarette smoking causes cancer. Sally might attempt to make light of evidence linking cigarette smoking to disease, comforting herself with the thought that medical science is imperfect. After all, she might say, aren't scientists always changing their minds about what's good for you? She might seek out intelligent people who smoke and, by so doing, convince herself that if Debbie, Nicole, and Larry smoke, it can't be all that harmful. Sally might switch to an ultralight or organic brand and delude herself that it's healthier. Finally, she might add cognitions that are consonant with smoking in an attempt to make the behavior less absurd in spite of its danger. She might enhance the value she places on smoking, deciding that smoking is not only pleasurable but essential for relaxation. I may lead a shorter life, but it will be a more enjoyable one. Or she might try to make a virtue out of smoking by developing a romantic, devil-may-care self-image, flouting danger by smoking. Sally can justify her behavior by cognitively minimizing its danger or by exaggerating its importance in her life. She can find relief by modifying an existing attitude, by constructing a new one, or by doing a little of both. All of these efforts reduce dissonance by downplaying the absurdity of courting disease. In 1964, about half of the American population smoked cigarettes. With the release that year of the Surgeon General's report, which alerted the public to the dangers of smoking, a survey was conducted to assess people's reactions to the new evidence linking smoking with cancer. Non-smokers overwhelmingly believed the health report, only 10% doubted smoking caused the disease. Smokers, however, disparaged the report. 40% of the heavy smokers doubted a link had been proven. They were also more apt to rationalize their habit. More than twice as many smokers as non-smokers agreed that life is full of hazards and that both smokers and non-smokers get sick. Smokers can also reduce dissonance by minimizing the extent of their habit. Another study of people who smoked between 1 and 2 packs of cigarettes a day found that 60% considered themselves to be moderate smokers. The remaining 40% considered themselves to be heavy smokers. How can we explain these different self-perceptions? People who considered themselves moderates were more aware of the harmful long-term effects of smoking than were those who called themselves heavy smokers. The moderates apparently reduced dissonance by convincing themselves that smoking 1 or 2 packs a day isn't really all that much. Moderate and heavy are, after all, subjective terms. Now imagine the plight of cigarette smokers who know they are heavy smokers, know that smoking is harmful, and so try to stop smoking but fail. What do these people do? To find out, Rick Gibbons and his colleagues studied heavy smokers who attended a smoking cessation clinic, quit smoking for a while, but then relapsed. Did they simply swallow hard and prepare to get sick and die? Not at all. Instead, they reduced dissonance in a different way, by convincing themselves that smoking isn't as bad as they originally thought. Likewise, a study that tracked the progress of 135 students who made New Year's resolutions supports this observation. Individuals who broke their resolutions, to quit smoking, lose weight, or exercise more, initially felt bad but, after a short time, succeeded in downplaying the importance of the resolution. Smokers, of course, have only their own health to worry about. But what if you are one of the top executives of a major cigarette company and therefore in a situation of maximum commitment to the sales of cigarettes all over the world? If it is true that cigarette smoking causes cancer, then in a sense, you are partially responsible for the illness and death of millions of people. This realization would produce a painful degree of dissonance. Your cognition, I am a decent, kind human being, would be dissonant with your cognition, I am contributing to the early death of millions of people. To reduce this dissonance, you must try to convince yourself that cigarette smoking is safe, not an easy task given that you are frequently confronted with anti-smoking rhetoric and accusations that you are evil. You must also refute the mountain of scientific evidence documenting a link between cigarettes and disease. Moreover, to bolster your disbelief in the evidence, you might smoke a pack or 2 a day. Yourself. If your need is great enough, you might even succeed in convincing yourself that cigarettes are good for people. Thus, to see yourself as wise, good, and right, you take action that is stupid, wrong, and detrimental to your own health. This analysis sounds so fantastic that it's almost beyond belief, almost. In 1994, Congress conducted hearings on the dangers of smoking. At these hearings, the top executives of every major tobacco company admitted they were smokers and brazenly argued that cigarettes are no more harmful or addictive than playing video games or eating Twinkies. In a subsequent hearing in 1997, James J. Morgan, president and chief executive officer of Philip Morris, the leading U.S. cigarette manufacturer, said that cigarettes are not pharmacologically addictive. "Look, I like gummy bears and I eat gummy bears. And I don't like it when I don't eat gummy bears," Morgan said. "But I'm certainly not addicted to them." It is possible that Morgan was lying. But I think what he said is more complicated than that. My guess is that, over time, people like Morgan begin to believe their own lies, in an effort to deceive themselves. Point 10. People's self-deceptions can even lead directly to their self-destruction. In 1997, 39 members of Heaven's Gate, an obscure religious cult, were found dead at a luxury estate in Rancho Santa Fe, California, participants in a mass suicide. Several weeks earlier, a few members of the cult had walked into a specialty store and purchased an expensive high-powered telescope so that they might get a clearer view of the Hale-Bopp comet and the spaceship they fervently believed was traveling behind it. They were convinced that when the comet got close to Earth, it would be time to rid themselves of their earthly containers by killing themselves, so that their essence could be picked up by the spaceship. A few days after buying the telescope, they brought it back to the store and politely asked for a refund. When the manager asked why, they complained that the telescope was defective. "We found the comet all right, but we can't find the spaceship that's following it." Needless to say, there was no spaceship. But if you are so convinced of the existence of a spaceship that you're ready to die to ride on it, and yet your telescope doesn't reveal it, then obviously there must be something wrong with the telescope. The members of Heaven's Gate may have had a tragically misguided conviction, but they illuminate a central scientific contribution of dissonance theory. Not unlike members of cults, whenever we feel a strong allegiance to a religion, political party, charismatic leader, or ideology, we too are capable of coming up with all kinds of distortions of the evidence when those loyalties are challenged by facts. Lenny Bruce, a perceptive comedian and social commentator, had the following insight into the 1960 presidential election campaign between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy. "I would be with a bunch of Kennedy fans watching the debate, and their comment would be, 'He's really slaughtering Nixon.' Then we would all go to another apartment, and the Nixon fans would say, 'How do you like the shellacking he gave Kennedy?' And then I realized that each group loved their candidate so that a guy would have to be this blatant. He would have to look into the camera and say, 'I am a thief, a crook. Do you hear me? I am the worst choice you could ever make for the presidency.' And even then his following would say, 'Now there's an honest man for you.' It takes a big guy to admit that. There's the kind of guy we need for President 11. More than 50 years later, presidential candidate Donald Trump marveled at the same unconditional loyalty of his own supporters. "I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and wouldn't lose any voters, okay?" It's, like, incredible. 12. Dissonance reduction and irrational behavior. Cognitive dissonance results from the clash of two fundamental motives: our striving to be right, which motivates us to pay close attention to what other people are doing and to heed the advice of trustworthy communicators, and our striving to believe we are right. Sometimes our motivation to be right and our motivation to believe we are right work in the same direction. We seek information and pay attention. But the theory of cognitive dissonance predicts that more often we seek information and then ignore it if we don't like what we learn. Understanding dissonance explains why so much of human thinking is not rational, but rationalizing. No matter how smart they are, people who are in the midst of reducing dissonance are so involved with convincing themselves that they are right that they frequently end up behaving irrationally. By irrational, I mean their maladaptive behavior can prevent them from learning essential facts or from finding real solutions to their problems. In the laboratory, researchers have amply demonstrated the irrationality of people's efforts to reduce dissonance. Suppose you have strong feelings about whether or not the death penalty deters people from committing murder. I now give you a series of arguments on both sides of the issue. Some of those arguments are plausible and others are silly. Which arguments will you remember best? If you are thinking rationally, you should remember the plausible arguments best and the implausible arguments least, regardless of your own position. But what does dissonance theory predict? A silly argument that supports your own position arouses some dissonance because it raises doubts about the wisdom of that position or the intelligence of people who agree with it. Likewise, a sensible argument on the other side of the issue also arouses some dissonance because it raises the possibility that the other side might be smarter or more accurate than you had thought, or, God forbid, that they might be right. Because these arguments arouse dissonance, we try not to think about them. Dissonance theory predicts that people will remember the plausible arguments agreeing with their own position and the implausible arguments agreeing with the opposing position. Point 13. In one of many studies that demonstrated this phenomenon, Charles Lord, Lee Ross, and Mark Lepper 14 selected several Stanford University students who opposed capital punishment and several who favored it. They showed the students 2 research articles that discussed whether the death penalty tends to deter violent crimes. One study confirmed and the other study disconfirmed the existing beliefs of the students. If these students were perfectly rational, they might conclude that the issue is a complex one, and accordingly, the 2 groups of students might move closer to each other in their beliefs about capital punishment. But dissonance theory predicts that they would distort the 2 articles, clasping the confirming article to their bosoms and hailing it as brilliant confirmation of their belief, while finding methodological or conceptual flaws in the disconfirming article and refusing to be influenced by it. This is precisely what happened. Indeed, rather than coming closer in their beliefs after being exposed to this 2-sided presentation, the students disagreed with each other more sharply than they did beforehand. This process probably accounts for the fact that, on issues like politics and religion, people who are deeply committed will almost never come to see things our way, no matter how powerful and balanced our arguments are. Point 15. This study illuminates the state of polarized political discourse in America today. The theory of cognitive dissonance explains why a good deal of people's behavior is not rational, and why, from inside, they think it is. If you ask the hypnotized young man why he wore a raincoat on a sunny day, he'll come up with an answer he feels is sensible. If you ask the vice president of Philip Morris why he smokes, he'll give you a reason that makes sense to him. He'll tell you how good it is for everyone's health to have a stress buster. If you ask participants in the death penalty experiment why they remembered one particular set of arguments rather than others, they will insist that the evidence against their position is flawed. It goes without saying that we are all capable of behaving rationally. But my point is that we are all capable of behaving irrationally when we need to reduce dissonance. We will see both sides of human behavior over and over as we discuss some of the wide ramifications of our need for self-justification. Let us begin with the decision-making process, a process that shows humans at their most rational and their most irrational in quick succession. Dissonance as a consequence of making a decision. Suppose you are about to make a decision about buying a new car. This involves a significant amount of money, so it is, by definition, important. After looking around, you are torn between getting a sports utility vehicle and an all-electric model. Each has advantages and disadvantages. The SUV would be convenient, you can haul things in it and sleep in it during long trips, and it has plenty of power, but it gets atrocious mileage and is not easy to park. The electric car is less roomy, you can't drive long distances in it, and you are concerned about its safety, but it is less expensive to buy and operate, it is more fun to drive, and you've heard it has a pretty good repair record. My guess is that before you make the decision, you will seek as much information as you can. Chances are you will go online and sample reviews of the various makes and models. Perhaps you'll confer with friends who own an SUV or an electric car. You'll probably visit the dealers to test drive the vehicles to see how each one feels. All of this pre-decision behavior is perfectly rational. Now you make a decision, you buy the all-electric car. What happens next? Your behavior will begin to change. No longer will you seek objective information about all makes of cars. Chances are you will spend more time talking with other owners of your car. You will begin to talk about its small carbon footprint and how far it goes on a charge. My guess is that you will not be spending any time thinking about the fact that you can't sleep in your new car. Similarly, your mind will skim lightly over the fact that driving your new little car can be hazardous in a collision and that the brakes are not very responsive. How does your change of mind come about? Following a decision, especially a difficult one or one that involves a significant amount of time or money, people almost always experience dissonance. They do because their choice is seldom entirely positive and the rejected alternatives are seldom entirely negative. In this example, your cognition that you bought an electric car is dissonant with your cognition about any deficiencies the car may have. Similarly, all the positive aspects of the other cars that you thought about buying are dissonant with your cognition that you didn't buy one of them. A good way to reduce such dissonance is to seek out exclusively positive information about the car you chose and avoid negative information about it. Accordingly, I would predict that a person who had recently bought a car will begin to read advertisements selectively, reading more ads about his or her car after the purchase than people who have not recently bought the same model. Moreover, owners of new cars will tend to steer clear of ads for other makes of cars. And that is just what researchers found in a study of ad readership. Point 16 Today, of course, thanks to social media, people do not have to work hard to get information that is consonant not only with what car they just bought but also what idea they now believe, and avoid any information that is dissonant. People do not always need help from Madison Avenue to gain reassurance. They can do a pretty good job of reassuring themselves. An experiment by Jack Brem 17 demonstrates how they do this. Posing as a marketing researcher, Brem showed several women 8 different appliances and asked that they rate them in terms of how appealing each appliance was. As a reward, each woman was told she could have one of the appliances as a gift, and she was given a choice between 2 of the products she had rated as being equally desirable. After she chose one, it was wrapped up and given to her. Several minutes later, she was asked to rate the products again. After receiving the appliance of her choice, each woman rated its appeal somewhat higher and decreased the rating of the appliance she had had a chance to own but rejected. Again, making a decision produces dissonance. Cognitions about any negative aspects of the preferred object are dissonant with having chosen it, and cognitions about the positive aspects of the unchosen object are dissonant with not having chosen it. To reduce dissonance, people cognitively spread apart the alternatives. That is, after making their decision, the women in Brem's study emphasized the positive attributes of the appliance they decided to own while de-emphasizing its negative attributes. For the appliance they decided not to own, they emphasized its negative attributes and de-emphasized its positive attributes. The tendency to justify our choices is not limited to consumer decisions. In fact, research has demonstrated that similar processes can even affect our romantic relationships and our willingness to imagine becoming involved with other partners. In a study conducted by Dennis Johnson and Carol Rusbolt, 18 college students were asked to evaluate the probable success of a new computer dating service on campus. Participants were shown pictures of individuals of the opposite sex, who they believed were applicants to the dating service. They were then asked to rate the attractiveness of these applicants, as well as how much they believed they would enjoy a potential date with him or her, a possibility that was presented in a realistic manner. The results of this study were remarkably similar to Brem's findings about appliances. The more heavily committed the students were to their current romantic partners, the less attractive they found potential new partners. In a subsequent experiment, Jeffrey Simpson and his colleagues 19 also found that those in committed straight relationships saw opposite-sex persons as less physically and sexually attractive than did those who weren't in committed relationships. In addition, they showed that this effect holds only for available others. When shown individuals who were somewhat older or who were of the same sex, people in committed straight relationships did not lower their attractiveness ratings of the strangers. In short, no threat, no dissonance, no diminishing their appeal. Whether we are talking about appliances or romantic partners, once you have made a firm commitment, you will tend to focus on the positive aspects of your choices and downplay the appeal of the alternatives. Is dissonance reduction conscious? As we saw in Chapter 2, most of us aren't good at predicting how quickly we will adjust to negative events. Now I can tell you why, because people are unaware of how successfully they will reduce dissonance. Given that they have successfully done so in the past, why aren't they aware that they will do so in the future? The answer is that the process of reducing dissonance is largely unconscious. People don't sit down and say, I guess I will reduce some dissonance now. For example, what happens when the person you love dumps you? Over time, you will come to see the person as less lovable, perhaps even as an insufferable narcissist, and come to believe that you deserve better or are better off alone. This process is effective precisely because it happens below the level of conscious awareness and without intention. Unfortunately, this invisibility makes dissonance both effective and forgettable. Because the process is unconscious, we do not realize that it will protect us from pain in the future. What would have happened at the end of the classic movie Casablanca if Ingrid Bergman did not rejoin her Nazi-fighting hero husband but instead remained with her lover Humphrey Bogart in Morocco? Would she, as Bogart tells her in a famously heart-wrenching speech, have regretted it, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon? And for the rest of your life? Or would she forever regret leaving Bogart behind at the rainy airport? I suspect that the answer to both questions is no. Bogart was eloquent but wrong. She might have regretted whichever choice she made for today or for tomorrow, but soon she would have convinced herself that she had made the best decision. 20. This is not to say we never have regrets. But given the countless decisions we make in our lives, it is remarkable how seldom we have them, thanks to our ability to reduce dissonance. Is dissonance universal? How universal is the experience of cognitive dissonance? Is it something that is experienced mostly by Americans, or is it part and parcel of the human condition? It is impossible to answer that question definitively, because dissonance experiments have not been done everywhere. But I can say this, although most of the research has been done in North America, the effects have been shown to exist in every part of the world where research has been done. And that research has been extensive. Cognitive dissonance theory has been supported by thousands of studies, some in related fields such as cognition and neuroscience, and even primatology. In some respects, monkeys are like those homemakers faced with choices between appliances. Offered a choice between two differently colored boxes of treats, they are likely to stay with the one they pick, even when another option comes along. This research suggests that there is an evolutionary benefit to post-decision dissonance, if it led our forebears to stick with a tried-and-true option and reject something new but untested. 21. Humans, who contributed the cognitive part to cognitive dissonance, also display cognitive justifications at a very early age. 22. A friend of mine took her 3-year-old to the park and gave her some stickers to play with. Another child approached them. Wouldn't you like to offer some of your stickers to that other little girl? My friend asked. The child thought for a while and said, that little girl doesn't like stickers, Mommy. Dissonance reduction at age 3. She gets to see herself as a good little girl and keep all of her stickers. In support of the argument that the experience of dissonance is universal, Eddie Harmon-Jones and his colleagues 23 have used fMRI technology to monitor neural activity in specific areas of the brain while people were experiencing various kinds of dissonance, rating their preferences for things they had chosen and those they had rejected. Arguing that the uncomfortable scanner experience was actually quite pleasant, or being confronted with unwelcome information. The areas of the brain that are activated during dissonance include highly specific areas within the prefrontal cortex, the site prominently involved in planning and decision-making. And in a study of people who were trying to process dissonant or consonant information about their preferred presidential candidate, Drew Weston and his colleagues 24 found that the reasoning areas of the brain virtually shut down when a person is confronted with dissonant information, and the emotion circuits of the brain light up happily when consonance is restored. As Weston put it, people twirl the cognitive kaleidoscope until the pieces fall into the pattern they want to see, and then the brain repays them by activating circuits involved in pleasure. It seems that the feeling of cognitive dissonance can literally make your brain hurt. Dissonance operates in almost every part of the world, but it does not always take the same form, and the content of the cognitions that produce it may differ across cultures. For example, in less individualistic societies than ours, dissonance-reducing behavior might take a more communal form. 25. In such cultures, we would be more likely to feel dissonance when their behavior shames or disappoints others than when they need to justify personal misbehavior. This is just what the Japanese social psychologist Haruki Sakai 26 found in his experiments. In Japan, many people will vicariously experience dissonance on the part of someone they know and like, and they will change their attitudes to conform to those of their dissonance-reducing friends. Moreover, the Japanese justified their choices when they felt others were observing them while they were making their decision, but not when they were making decisions privately. This pattern was reversed for Americans. 27. The perceived privacy or public visibility of the choice being made interacts with culture to determine whether dissonance is aroused and the choice needs to be justified. The importance of irrevocability. A key characteristic of the examples we have discussed is the relative irrevocability of the decision, the person's inability to undo it. This needs some explaining. As we saw, while you are thinking tentatively about buying a car or making another decision, you don't need to expend effort trying to convince yourself of the wisdom of your choice. But once you decide and you can't go back, it all changes. Some direct evidence for the importance of irrevocability comes from a study of the cognitive gyrations of gamblers at a racetrack. The racetrack is an ideal place to scrutinize irrevocability, because once you've placed your bet, you can't go back and tell the nice person behind the window you've changed your mind. Robert Knox and James Inkster 28 simply intercepted people who were on their way to place $2 bets. They had already decided on their horses and were about to place their bets when the investigators asked them how certain they were that their horses would win. Because they were on their way to the $2 window, their decisions were not irrevocable. The investigators collared other bettors just as they were leaving the $2 window, after having placed their bets, and asked them how certain they were that their horses would win. Typically, people who had just placed their bets gave their horses a much better chance of winning than did those who were about to place their bets. But, of course, nothing had changed except the finality of the decision. Moving from the racetrack to the Harvard campus, Daniel Gilbert 29 tested the irrevocability hypothesis with students interested in learning photography. He told them to shoot a roll of film and print 2 of the photographs, rating them and choosing one to keep. Some students had the option to exchange photographs within a 5-day period, while others were told their first choice was final. Gilbert then contacted them 2, 4, and 9 days later, to see if their feelings about the photographs had changed. Those who made their final choice on the first day liked their choice more than those who had the option of exchanging photographs. Again, once a decision is irrevocable, people get busy making themselves feel good about the choice they made. And thus, they frequently become more certain that they have made a wise decision once there is nothing they can do about it. Although the irrevocability of a decision always increases dissonance and the motivation to reduce it, sometimes people feel dissonance even when technically they could get out of the decision. Years ago, Robert Cialdini 30 demonstrated how this works by temporarily joining the sales force of an automobile dealer. That's how he identified a common and successful ploy called lowballing, or throwing the customer a lowball. It works like this: a customer goes to a car dealer prepared to pay $19,300 for their dream car, a price advertised as an incredible bargain. The dealer, smiling, says, "I'll go you one better," and offers the customer the car for $18,942. Excited by the bargain, the buyer agrees to the deal and writes out a check for the down payment, happily anticipating driving home in that shiny new car. Alas, 10 minutes later, the dealer returns with a forlorn look on his face. It seems, he says, that he made a calculation error, and the sales manager caught it. The price of the car is actually $19,384. What will the buyer do? The customer can get this car cheaper elsewhere, so the decision to buy this one is not irrevocable. And yet far more people in this situation will go ahead with the deal than if the original asking price had been $19,384, even though the reason for purchasing the car from this dealer no longer exists. Lowballing. An unscrupulous strategy in which a customer agrees to purchase a product at a very low cost, after which the salesperson claims that price was an error and then raises the price, betting that the customer will agree to make the purchase at the inflated price, which he or she often does. What is going on in this situation? There are at least 3 important things to notice. First, while the customer's decision to buy is certainly reversible, there is an implicit commitment created by the act of signing a check for a down payment. Second, this commitment triggered the anticipation of a pleasant experience, driving out with a new car. To have the anticipated event thwarted would have produced dissonance and disappointment. Third, although the final price is higher than the salesman said it would be, it is only slightly higher than the price somewhere else. Under these circumstances, the customer says, in effect, "Oh, what the hell? I'm already here, I've already filled out the forms, why wait?" Lowballing rarely applies nowadays when people buy cars, as the internet has made people smarter and more informed consumers. But it applies in many other situations when we are not so informed, as in replacing an expired cell phone contract with a new one that promises a great bargain. The decision to behave immorally. How can an honest person become corrupt? Conversely, how can we get a person to be more honest? One way is through the dissonance that results from making a difficult decision. Suppose you are enrolled in a tough biology course. Your grade will hinge on the final exam you are now taking. The key question involves some material you know fairly well, but, because of anxiety, you draw a blank. You are sitting there in a nervous sweat. You look up, and lo and behold, you happen to be sitting behind a woman who is the smartest person in the class. You glance down and notice she is just completing her answer to the crucial question. You know you could easily read her answer if you chose to. What do? Your conscience tells you it's wrong to cheat, and yet, if you don't cheat, you are certain to get a poor grade. You wrestle with your conscience. Regardless of whether you decide to cheat or not, you are doomed to experience dissonance. If you cheat, your cognition, "I am a decent, moral person," is dissonant with your cognition, "I have just committed an immoral act." If you decide to resist temptation, your cognition, "I want to get a good grade," is dissonant with your cognition, "I could have acted in a way that would have ensured a good grade, but I chose not to." Suppose that, after a difficult struggle, you decide to cheat. How do you reduce the dissonance? Before you read on, think about it for a moment. One way to reduce dissonance is to minimize the negative aspects of the action you have chosen and maximize the positive aspects, much the same way the women did after choosing an appliance in Jack Brem's experiment. In this instance, the most efficient way to reduce dissonance would be to change your attitude about cheating. If you cheat, you will adopt a more lenient attitude. Your reasoning might go something like this: cheating isn't so bad under some circumstances. As long as nobody gets hurt, it's really not very immoral. Anybody would do it. Therefore, it's a part of human nature, so how could it be bad? Since it is only human, those who get caught cheating should not be severely punished but should be treated with understanding. But suppose that, after a difficult struggle, you decide not to cheat. How would you reduce dissonance, that is, make your action consonant with your belief? Once again, you could change your attitude about the morality of the act, but in the opposite direction. To justify giving up a good grade, you must convince yourself that cheating is a heinous sin, one of the lowest things a person can do, and that cheaters should be found out and severely punished. The essential thing to remember here is that two people acting in these two different ways could have started out with almost identical attitudes. Their decisions might have been a hair's breadth apart. One came within an ace of resisting but decided to cheat, while the other came within an ace of cheating but decided to resist. Once they have made their decisions, however, their attitudes toward cheating will diverge sharply as a consequence of their decisions. These speculations were put to the test by Judson Mills 31 in an experiment with 6th graders. Mills first measured their attitudes toward cheating. He then had the children participate in a competitive exam with prizes being offered to the winners. The situation was arranged so that it was almost impossible to win without cheating. Also, it was easy for the children to cheat, thinking they would not be detected. As you might expect, some of the students cheated and others did not. The next day, the 6th graders were again asked to indicate how they felt about cheating. In general, those children who had cheated became more lenient toward cheating, and those who resisted the temptation to cheat adopted a harsher attitude toward cheating. To visualize the Mills experiment as it applies to you, imagine yourself at the top of a pyramid. As you go through life, you will face many decisions that will require you to step off that pyramid in one direction or another, what to major in, whether to go along with friends who are doing something illegal or unethical or not rock the boat, whether to stay in a romantic relationship or leave, whether to believe some conspiracy claim or check it out on Snopes.com or PolitiFact. The minute you take a step in one direction or the other, however, you will feel dissonance, and now you will be motivated to justify what you did to reduce it. That justification, in turn, makes it harder for you to change your mind, even when you should. By the time you are at the bottom of the pyramid, you will be very far apart from those who faced the same dilemmas but who made a different decision and stepped off the pyramid in the opposite direction. And you will have convinced yourself that your decision was absolutely, positively the right one, and that those people who slid down on the other side are idiots or crooks. The pyramid metaphor is also useful in helping us understand how attitudes and behavior can change through the process of entrapment, or how people can start off making a small, impulsive decision and, over time, find themselves a long way from their original goals and intentions. The process underlying entrapment has been explored under controlled experimental conditions. Suppose you would like to enlist someone's aid in a massive undertaking, but you know the job you have in mind for the person is so difficult and will require so much time and effort that the person will surely decline. What should you do? One possibility is to get the person involved in a much smaller aspect of the job, one so easy that he or she wouldn't dream of turning it down. This action serves to commit the individual to the cause. Once people are thus committed, the likelihood of their complying with the larger request increases. Entrapment. The process by which people make a small decision, justify it, and over time find themselves increasingly committed to a belief or activity. This phenomenon was demonstrated by Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser, 32, who attempted to induce homeowners to put up a huge sign in their front yards, reading, "Drive carefully." Because of the ugliness and obtrusiveness of this sign, most residents refused, only 17% complied. A different group of residents, however, was first softened up by an experimenter who got them to sign a petition favoring safe driving. Because signing a petition is an easy thing to do, virtually all who were asked agreed to sign. A few weeks later, a different experimenter went to each resident with the obtrusive ugly sign reading, "Drive carefully." This time, more than 55% of these residents allowed the sign to be put up on their property. Thus, when individuals commit themselves in a small way, the likelihood increases that they will commit themselves further in that direction. This process of using small favors to encourage people to accede to larger requests has been dubbed the foot-in-the-door technique. It is effective because having done the smaller favor provides justification in advance for agreeing to do the larger favor. Similar results were obtained by Patricia Plinner and her associates. 33 When they asked people to make a small donation to the American Cancer Society, 46% agreed. But when, a day earlier, they had induced a similar group of people to wear a lapel pin publicizing the fundraising drive, and then approached them the next day for a contribution, approximately twice as many agreed. Entrapment through self-justification can thus be used for altruistic, socially admirable goals, but also for devastating, self-defeating ones, as we will see at the end of this chapter. Foot-in-the-door technique. The process of using small favors to encourage people to accede to larger requests. The psychology of insufficient justification. Attitude change as a means of reducing dissonance is not limited to post-decision situations. It can occur in countless other contexts, including every time a person says something he or she doesn't believe or does something foolish or immoral. Of course, in a complex society, we occasionally find ourselves saying or doing things we don't completely believe. Does this always lead us to change our minds? No. I will choose a simple example. Joe enters the office and sees that his law partner, Joyce, has hung a perfectly atrocious painting on the wall of the office they share. He is about to tell her how awful he thinks it is when she says proudly, "How do you like the painting?" "I did it myself." "Very nice, Joyce," Joe answers. Theoretically, Joe's cognition, "I am a truthful person," is dissonant with the cognition, "I said that painting was nice," although it really is unbelievably ugly. Whatever dissonance might be aroused by this inconsistency can easily and quickly be reduced by Joe's cognition that it is wrong to hurt other people. I lied so as not to hurt Joyce. Why should I tell her it's ugly? It serves no useful purpose. This is an effective way of reducing dissonance because it completely justifies Joe's action. In effect, the justification is situation determined. We call this external justification. External justification. A person's justification for his or her dissonant behavior that is situation determined, but what happens if there is not ample justification in the situation itself? In such cases we need to create internal justification, a change in attitude used to justify behavior. If you do or say something that is difficult to justify externally, you will attempt to justify it internally by making your attitudes more consistent with what you did or said. Internal justification. The reduction of dissonance by changing something about oneself in the direction of one's statements. These speculations have been investigated scientifically in several experiments, notably a classic study by Leon Festinger and J. Merrill Carl Smith. 34 These investigators asked college students to do a boring and repetitive series of tasks, packing spools in a tray, dumping them out, and then refilling the tray over and over, or turning rows and rows of screws a quarter turn and then going back and turning them another quarter turn. The students did these mindless activities for a full hour. The experimenter then induced them to lie about the task, specifically, by telling a young woman that the task she would be performing was interesting and enjoyable. Some of the students were offered $20 for telling this lie, others were offered only $1. After the experiment was over, an interviewer asked the liars how much they enjoyed the tasks they had done earlier in the experiment. How do you suppose the students who had been paid $20 for lying replied? They rated all that spool packing and screw turning as dull. This is not surprising, those tasks were dull. But what about the students who had been paid only $1 for lying? They rated the task as enjoyable. In other words, people who received abundant external justification for lying told the lie but didn't believe it, whereas those who told the lie in the absence of external justification moved in the direction of believing that what they said about the task was true. We call this result the saying is believing paradigm, because under these circumstances, people will come to believe their own statements. If you want to get a person to change an attitude, get them to do or say something counter-attitudinal and underpay them for it. Research on this idea has extended beyond relatively unimportant attitudes like the dullness of a task. Attitude change has been shown on a variety of more serious issues in which people argue for a position that is exactly the opposite of the one they believe in. Arthur R. Cohen 35 conducted an experiment with Yale students immediately after a student riot in which the New Haven police had overreacted, clubbing and arresting protesters. The students were asked to write a strong and forceful essay in support of police. The experimenters paid students anything from a meager 50 cents to a full $10 for writing the brief essay. Later they were asked to indicate their true feelings about the New Haven police. The results were perfectly linear. The less they were paid for writing in support of the police, the more liking for the police they expressed later. Saying had become believing, but mainly if they hadn't been well paid for what they said. Thus, dissonance theory predicts that we begin to believe the things we say, but only if we don't have enough external justification for saying them. The smaller the bribe used to get you to give a speech, the more likely it is that you will feel the need to justify delivering it by convincing yourself that the things you said were true. This mechanism is so powerful that it not only helps explain how attitudes change, it can affect the way we experience basic physiological drives. Imagine that our friend Sam is induced to commit himself to a situation in which he will be deprived of food or water for a long time or in which he will be given electric shocks. If Sam doesn't have a good external reason for doing this, he will experience dissonance. His cognitions concerning his hunger pangs, his parched throat, or the pain of electric shock are each dissonant with his cognition that he volunteered to go through these experiences and is not getting much in return. To reduce this dissonance, Sam convinces himself that the hunger isn't so intense, or the thirst isn't so bad, or the pain isn't so terrible. Such self-persuasion is not as surprising or difficult as it might seem. Although hunger, thirst, and pain all have physiological bases, they also have a strong psychological component. That is why suggestion, meditation, hypnosis, placebo pills, the bedside manner of a skillful physician, or some combination of these can reduce people's perceived pain. Experimental social psychologists have shown that, under conditions of high dissonance arousal, ordinary people, with no special skills in hypnosis or meditation, can accomplish the same things for themselves. For example, Philip Zimbardo 36 subjected his study participants to intense electric shocks. Half were in a high dissonance condition, that is, they were induced to commit themselves to volunteer for the experience and were given little external justification. The other half were in a low dissonance condition, they had no choice in the matter, giving them plenty of external justification. People in the high dissonance condition reported feeling less pain than those in the low dissonance condition. Even their physiological response to pain was somewhat less intense, and the pain did not interfere as much with the tasks they were performing. Thus, not only did they report less pain than the low dissonance group, but objectively, they were less bothered by it. Similar results have been shown for hunger and thirst. Jack Brem 37 reported a series of experiments in which people were deprived of either food or water for long periods. Like Zimbardo's participants, some had low external justification for going through this unpleasant experience, whereas others had high external justification. In separate experiments on hunger and thirst, Brem found that high dissonance participants said they were less hungry than low dissonance participants who were deprived of food for the same length of time. Again, this was no mere verbal report. After the experiment, when all of the participants were allowed to eat freely, those in the high dissonance condition consumed less food than those in the low dissonance condition. What constitutes external justification? Monetary gain or a forced requirement to do something is not the only form of external justification. People can be persuaded to say or do things that contradict their beliefs or preferences if they are enticed by other rewards, such as praise or the desire to please. Furthermore, most of us would probably agree to do something that we otherwise wouldn't do if a good friend asked us to do it as a favor. To take a far-fetched example, suppose a friend asked you to eat an unusual food she or he had recently learned to prepare in an exotic foods cooking class. And just to make things interesting, let's say the food in question was a fried grasshopper. Now, imagine the reverse situation, that someone you didn't like asked you to sink your teeth into a fried grasshopper. Okay, are you ready? Assuming you went ahead and ate the grasshopper, under which circumstance do you think you would enjoy the taste of it more, when asked to eat it by a good friend or by someone you didn't like? Common sense might suggest that the grasshopper would taste better when recommended by a friend. After all, a friend is someone you can trust and, hence, would be a more credible source of information than someone you didn't like. But think about it for a moment, which condition involves less external justification? Common sense notwithstanding, the theory of cognitive dissonance would predict that you would come to like eating grasshoppers more if you ate one at the request of someone you didn't like. Your cognition that eating a grasshopper is repulsive would be at odds with the fact that you just ate one. But if it was your friend who made the request, you would have enough external justification for having eaten it. You pleased someone you like. But you would not have much external justification for munching on a grasshopper if you did it at the request of someone you didn't like. In this case, how could you justify your contradictory behavior to yourself? Simple, start liking grasshoppers. Gee, they're pretty tasty critters after all. Philip Zimbardo and his colleagues 38 had an army officer instruct a group of reservists to eat grasshoppers, rating their liking for them before and after tasting them. Reservists found the grasshoppers significantly tastier if the officer who asked them to eat it acted like a jerk rather than behaving in a friendly and likable manner. Insufficient punishment. One clear form of external justification for behaving a certain way is knowing you'll be punished if you don't. We know that if we exceed the speed limit and get caught, we will pay a fine, and if it happens too often, we will lose our licenses. So we learn to obey the speed limit when police are in the vicinity. Schoolchildren know that if they cheat on an exam and get caught, they could be humiliated by the teacher and severely punished. So they learn not to cheat while the teacher is in the room watching them. But does the threat of punishment teach people not to speed or cheat? I don't think so. I think it teaches them to try to avoid getting caught. The use of threats of harsh punishment as a means of getting someone to refrain from doing something he or she enjoys doing requires constant vigilance. It would be much more efficient and would require much less restraint if, somehow, people could enjoy doing the things that contribute to their own health and welfare and to the health and welfare of others. If children enjoyed not beating up smaller kids or not cheating or not stealing from others, then society could relax its vigilance and punitiveness. It is extremely difficult to persuade people that it's not enjoyable to beat up smaller people. But it is conceivable that, under certain conditions, they will persuade themselves that such behavior is not enjoyable. Picture the scene: you are the parent of a 5-year-old boy who enjoys beating up his 3-year-old sister. You've tried to reason with him, but to no avail. So, to protect the welfare of your daughter and to make a nicer person out of your son, you begin to punish him for his aggressiveness. As a parent, you have at your disposal a number of punishments that range from extremely mild to extremely severe. The more severe the threat, the more likely that the boy will mend his ways while you are watching him. But he will probably hit his sister again as soon as you turn your back. Suppose instead you threaten him with a mild punishment. In either case, the child feels dissonance. He is aware that he is not beating up his little sister, and he is also aware that he would really like to beat her up. When he has the urge to hit his sister and doesn't, he asks himself, in effect, how come I'm not beating up my little sister? Under a severe threat, he has a ready-made answer in the form of sufficient external justification. I'm not beating her up because, if I do, that giant over there is going to spank me, stand me in the corner, and keep me from watching TV for a month. The severe threat has provided the child ample external justification for not hitting his sister while he's being watched. The child in the mild threat situation feels dissonance, too. But when he asks himself, how come I'm not beating up my little sister, he doesn't have a good answer because the threat is so mild that it does not provide abundant justification. The child isn't doing something he wants to do, and while he does have some justification for not doing it, he lacks complete justification. In this situation, he continues to experience dissonance, but he can't reduce it by simply blaming his inaction on a severe threat. The child must find a way to justify the fact that he is not aggressing against his little sister, and the best way is to try to convince himself that he really doesn't like to beat his sister up, that he didn't want to do it in the first place, and that beating up little kids isn't fun anyway. The less severe the threat, the less external justification, the less external justification, the greater the need for internal justification. Allowing people the opportunity to construct their own internal justification can help them develop a permanent set of values. To test this idea, I designed an experiment at the Harvard University Nursery School in collaboration with Merrill Carl Smith. 39 First, we asked 5-year-old children to rate the desirability of several toys. Then we told each child not to play with the toy they had rated as particularly appealing. We threatened half of the children with mild punishment for transgression, would be a little angry. We threatened the other half with more severe punishment, would be very angry. I would have to take all of the toys and go home and never come back again. I would think you were just a baby. After that, the kids were left alone to play with all the toys. All the children resisted the temptation to play with the forbidden toy. On returning to the room, the children again rated how much they liked all the toys. The results were both striking and exciting. Those children who had been threatened with mild punishment now found the forbidden toy less attractive than before. Lacking adequate external justification for refraining from playing with it, they succeeded in convincing themselves that they hadn't played with it because they didn't really like it. But the forbidden toy remained just as appealing to the children who were threatened with severe punishment. They continued to rate the forbidden toy as highly desirable. Indeed, some even found it more desirable than they had before the threat. The children in the severe threat condition had good external reasons for not playing with the toy. That big man is going to be very angry with me, and therefore had no need to find additional reasons. Consequently, they continued to like the toy. Jonathan Friedman 40 extended these findings and dramatically illustrated the permanence of the phenomenon. He used as his crucial toy an irresistible battery-powered robot that scurried around, hurling objects at a child's enemies. The other toys were sickly by comparison. Naturally, all of the children preferred the robot. He then asked them not to play with that toy, threatening some children with mild punishment and others with severe punishment. Then he left the school and never returned. Several weeks later, a young woman came to the school to administer some paper and pencil tests to the children. The children didn't know that she was working for Friedman or that her presence was in any way related to the toys or the threats that had occurred earlier. But it just so happened that she was administering her test in the same room Friedman had used for his experiment, the room where the same toys were casually scattered about. After she gave the children her test, she asked them to hang around while she scored it, suggesting, offhandedly, that they might want to amuse themselves with those toys someone had left in the room. The overwhelming majority of the children who had been mildly threatened weeks earlier refused to play with the robot. They played with the other toys instead. But the majority of the children who had been severely threatened went straight to the robot. Friedman's severe threat was not effective in inhibiting subsequent behavior, but one mild threat inhibited behavior as much as 9 weeks later. What is insufficient justification? Throughout this section, I have referred to situations in which there is insufficient external justification and to those with an abundance of external justification. These terms require some clarification. In the Festinger-Carlsmith experiment, all of the participants did, in fact, agree to tell the lie, including all of those paid only $1. In a sense, then, $1 was adequate, that is, sufficient to induce the participants to tell the lie, but it wasn't enough to prevent them from feeling foolish. To reduce their feelings of foolishness, they had to reduce the dissonance that resulted from telling a lie for so paltry a sum. This entailed additional bolstering in the form of convincing themselves that it wasn't completely a lie and the task wasn't quite as dull as it seemed at first. As a matter of fact, when looked at in a certain way, it was pretty interesting. In the grasshopper experiment, a friend was sufficient to persuade people to try eating the insect, but because they did it for a friend, that wasn't enough reason to like it. In the forbidden toy experiment, threats were sufficient to get the kids to avoid playing with the toy, but only the mild threats succeeded in making them not want to. It would be fruitful to compare these results with Judson Mills's data on the effects of cheating among 6th graders. Recall that, in Mills's experiment, the decision about whether to cheat was almost certainly a difficult one for most of the children. This is why they experienced dissonance, regardless of whether they cheated or resisted temptation. What do you think would happen if the rewards to be gained by cheating were large? You might predict that large rewards would make cheating more tempting, and therefore more children would cheat. But if the gains for cheating were astronomical, those who cheated would undergo little attitude change. Much like the college students who lied in Festinger and Carlsmith's $20 condition, those children who cheated for a substantial reward would have less need to reduce dissonance, having been provided with an abundance of external justification for their behavior. In fact, Mills included this refinement in his experiment, and his results supported the hypothesis. Those who cheated to obtain a small reward tended to soften their attitude about cheating more than those who cheated to obtain a large reward. Moreover, those who refrained from cheating in spite of the temptation of a large reward, a choice that would create a lot of dissonance, hardened their attitude about cheating to a greater extent than those who refrained in the face of a small reward. This was just as predicted. These results might be surprising to you. Some of my students used to wonder why cognitive dissonance theory always predicts the opposite of what seems to be common sense. But when you understand the theory, those predictions make a lot of sense. By and large, if you want someone to do something just once, while you are standing there watching them, then by all means provide them with the largest incentive you can deliver. If you offer that person $1 million to say that the North Korean dictator is a great humanitarian, or if you put a gun to their head and threaten to pull the trigger 6 times, chances are that person will say what you want, but they won't believe it. But if you want that person to develop a set of values or beliefs that they will act on even when you aren't there, then offer the person the smallest award that will bring about the behavior you want. That gets them to do the work of persuading themselves, which ensures that they will continue to do those things for years after you have left the room. Dissonance, the self-concept, and self-esteem. I now want to highlight a major departure from Festinger's original theory, one that has been embedded in some of the examples of dissonance I've already mentioned. In the experiment by Festinger and Carl Smith, the original statement of dissonance went like this: the cognition, "I believe the task is dull," is dissonant with the cognition, "I said the task was interesting." Years later, I went on to reformulate the theory in a way that focuses more attention on the way people conceive of themselves. 41. I demonstrated experimentally that dissonance is most painful, and we are most motivated to reduce it, in situations in which the self-concept is threatened, when we have done something that violates our view of ourselves. True, "I said X" is dissonant with "I don't believe X," but for me, the crucial element is that I have misled people. The cognition, "I have told people something I don't believe," is dissonant with my self-concept that I am a good person of integrity. As this reformulation would predict, people are less likely to cheat if they have a self-concept of being honest, not being a cheater, and when that self-concept is invoked. In one experiment, some students read instructions that highlighted their identity, whereas others read instructions that highlighted the action. They were then given the opportunity to cheat, by claiming money they weren't entitled to from the experimenter. The "please don't be a cheater" group was far less likely to cheat, because that would have created dissonance with their self-concept of being honest. The second group, which was asked to simply refrain from the behavior of cheating, claimed more than twice as much unearned money as people who were asked not to be cheaters. This difference occurred in a face-to-face situation as well as when it was done privately online. 42. Understanding the pain of dissonance when the self-concept is involved helps us sympathize with individuals who suffer when two central aspects of their identity conflict. In one study, for example, researchers wondered how gay men who strongly identified with their Christian church dealt with pronouncements from their ministers that the Bible prohibits homosexuality and that God hates gay people. One way to resolve dissonance would be to change their behavior, to try to suppress their sexual attraction to other men, change their church denomination, or even give up their religion altogether. But those who decide to stay in their church can resolve dissonance by saying that the Bible emphasizes compassion and love, and by emphasizing the shortcomings of the minister. For example, they might say, "It's not my religion that promotes anti-gay prejudice and this interpretation of the Bible. It's the narrow-mindedness of this particular preacher." 43. The importance of self-esteem. Who do you think feels the greatest dissonance after doing something cruel, foolish, or incompetent? A person with high self-esteem or low self-esteem? The answer is the people with the highest self-esteem. They experience the most dissonance when they behave in ways that are contrary to their high opinion of themselves, and they will work harder to reduce it than will those with average levels of self-esteem. 44. In contrast, when people who have low self-esteem commit an incompetent or unethical action, they do not feel as much dissonance, because the cognition, "I've done an awful thing," is consonant with their self-concept, which is the cognition, "I'm a loser, I often do awful things." Psychopaths are fairly immune from dissonance caused by behaving badly, because the cognition, "I just treated that person in a cold and heartless way," is consistent with, "I'm really good at manipulating all those stupid people who can't see through me." 45. One of the great advantages of my modification of cognitive dissonance theory is that in taking into account the self-concept of the psychopath and people with low self-esteem, it enhances the precision of predictions made by the theory. My reformulation of dissonance theory, however, was primarily based on my assumption that most people want to preserve their good feelings about themselves. If they do something cruel or thoughtless or incompetent, their self-esteem is threatened, because it makes them feel that they are cruel, thoughtless, or incompetent. In the thousands of experiments inspired by the theory of cognitive dissonance, the clearest results were obtained in those situations in which a person's self-esteem was threatened. I tested this idea in collaboration with David Meddy. 46. We predicted that, given the opportunity to cheat during a card game, individuals with a low opinion of themselves would be more likely to cheat than individuals who had a high opinion of themselves. We predicted that, if people receive a temporary blow to their self-esteem and thus feel low and worthless, they are more likely to cheat at cards, kick their dog, or do other ignoble things. As a function of feeling they are low people, individuals will commit low acts. In our experiment, we temporarily modified the self-esteem of college students by giving them false information about their personalities. After taking a personality test, some were given positive feedback and told the test indicated that they were mature, interesting, deep, and so forth. Another group received negative feedback and told the test indicated that they were relatively immature, uninteresting, rather shallow, and the like. Immediately afterward, they all played a gambling game that had no apparent relation to the personality inventory. They were allowed to bet money and were told they could keep whatever they won. In the course of the game, they were given a few opportunities to cheat in a situation where it seemed impossible to be detected. The situation was arranged so that if a student decided not to cheat, she would certainly lose, whereas if she decided to cheat, she would be certain to win a sizable sum of money. The students who had previously received information designed to lower their self-esteem cheated to a far greater extent than those who had received the high self-esteem information. The control group, those receiving no information, fell exactly in between. These findings suggest that parents and teachers should be alert to the potentially far-reaching consequences of their own behavior as it affects the self-esteem of their children and students. If high self-esteem can serve as a buffer against dishonest behavior and promote desirable behavior, then it might seem reasonable to do everything possible to help individuals learn to respect themselves. In support of this idea, Jeffrey Cohen and his associates 47 found that African American children received significantly higher grades if, at the beginning of the school year, their feelings of self-esteem were bolstered by classroom assignments that made them focus on their personal strengths and values. We must be cautious in generalizing from these results. Strengthening self-esteem is unlikely to produce positive effects if it is done in an artificial or superficial way, or if the person's self-esteem is not grounded in reality. 48. Moreover, it's important to separate healthy self-esteem from narcissism, having a false sense of grandiosity and superiority to others. A person with healthy, realistically grounded self-esteem, when given constructive criticism, says, "Why, thank you." This is not so for narcissists. Roy Baumeister, Brad Bushman, and Keith Campbell 49 found that when narcissists are threatened by criticism, they often aggress against their critics, in an attempt to get even and restore their threatened self-image. They asked participants to write an essay and then hand it to a partner to criticize. After receiving the criticism, the participants were given the opportunity to express hostility against their partners by blasting them with an unpleasant noise, at whatever decibel level they chose. The people who turned the noisemaker up to the highest levels were those who had scored high on measures of both self-esteem and narcissism and whose inflated opinion of themselves had been threatened. Christina Salmavalli and her colleagues 50 suggest that this syndrome, high narcissistic self-esteem, is not genuine high self-esteem at all, rather, it is paper-thin and self-aggrandizing and based on feelings of insecurity. This is the kind of self-esteem you find in schoolyard bullies, while youngsters with genuinely high self-esteem are more secure and do not engage in bullying. Indeed, they try to defend the bully's victims. We are now in a position to state a general principle about dissonance and the self-concept. Dissonance effects are greatest when people feel personally responsible for their actions. People's actions conflict with a central aspect of their self-concept. People's actions have serious consequences, and the action is irrevocable, a person can't take it back. Under those four conditions, people will feel the most dissonance, and the greater their dissonance, the more their attitudes will change. The fact that dissonance is aroused whenever the self-concept is challenged has many interesting ramifications. Let us look at some of them. The justification of effort. If we suffer to get something, chances are we will like it better than if it came more easily. And if that something isn't attractive, we may have to do some creative work to justify our efforts. Suppose you are a college student who decides to join a fraternity. To be admitted, you must pass an initiation. Let us assume it is a rather severe one that involves effort, pain, or embarrassment. After successfully completing the ordeal, you are admitted to the fraternity. When you move into the fraternity house, you find that your new roommate has some bad habits. He borrows money and forgets to repay you, he leaves dirty laundry on your bed, and he uses your stuff without asking. An objective person would see him as an inconsiderate slob. But you are not an objective person, your cognition that you went through hell to get into the fraternity in order to live with an inconsiderate slob is dissonant with your view of yourself as a rational, intelligent person who makes good decisions. To reduce dissonance, you will try to see your roommate and your experience in the most favorable light possible. Again, there are constraints imposed by reality. No matter how much pain and effort you went through, there is no way an inconsiderate slob can become Prince Charming, but, with a little ingenuity, you can convince yourself that he isn't so bad. What some people might call sloppy, for example, you might call laid back. Because he's so nice and casual about material things, it's certainly understandable that he would borrow and stain your best jacket and forget about the $50 he owes you. Prince Charming he isn't, but he's certainly tolerable. Contrast this viewpoint with what your attitude would have been had you made no investment of effort. Suppose you had moved into a regular campus dormitory and had been assigned the same guy with same bad habits. Because you neither chose this room, nor made any investment to get it, you would feel dissatisfaction but no dissonance. Because you feel no dissonance, you have no need to see your roommate in the best possible light. You could quickly write him off as an inconsiderate slob and try to make arrangements to move out. These speculations were tested in a classic experiment that I did more than 5 decades ago with my friend Judson Mills. Point 51 in this study, college women volunteered to join a group that would be meeting regularly to discuss various aspects of the psychology of sex. The women were told that if they wanted to join, they would first have to go through a screening test designed to ensure that everyone admitted to the group could discuss sex freely and openly. This instruction served to set the stage for the initiation procedure. 1/3 of the women were assigned to a severe initiation procedure, which required them to recite aloud a list of obscene words. 1/3 of the students underwent a mild procedure, in which they recited a list of words that were sexual but not obscene. The final 1/3 of the participants were admitted to the group without undergoing an initiation. Each participant was then allowed to listen in on a discussion being conducted by the members of the group she had just joined. Although the women were led to believe the discussion was a live, ongoing one, they actually listened to a pre-recorded discussion, designed to be as tedious and as bombastic as possible. Afterward, each participant was asked to rate the discussion in terms of how much she liked it, how interesting it was, how intelligent the participants were, and so forth. The results supported our predictions. The women who made little or no effort to get into the group did not enjoy the discussion much. They were able to see it for what it was, a dull and boring waste of time. Those who went through a severe initiation, however, succeeded in convincing themselves that the same discussion was interesting and worthwhile. Other investigators, using different kinds of unpleasant initiations, have gotten the same results as we did. For example, Harold Gerard and Grover Matthewson 52 conducted an experiment similar in concept to the Aronson-Mills study, except that the participants in the severe initiation condition were given painful electric shocks instead of a list of obscene words to read aloud. Those who underwent a series of severe electric shocks to become members of a group liked that group better than those who underwent a series of mild electric shocks. I am not asserting that people enjoy painful experiences, they do not, nor am I saying that people enjoy things because they are associated with painful experiences. What I am saying is that if a person goes through a difficult or a painful experience in order to attain some goal or object, that goal or object becomes more attractive, a process called the justification of effort. If, on your way to a discussion group, a flower pot fell from a ledge and you got hit on the head, you would not like that group any better, but if you volunteered to get hit on the head by a flower pot in order to join the group, you would definitely like the group better. Point 53. Justification of effort. When a person goes through a difficult or painful experience in order to attain some goal or object, thus making that goal or object more attractive. The biologist Robert Sapolsky 54 describes a medical phenomenon that took place in the 20th century that nicely demonstrates the justification of effort. At that time, some Swiss physicians believed that they could slow down the aging process by injecting men with testosterone. As Sapolsky put it, thus, a craze developed of aged, moneyed gentlemen checking into impeccable Swiss sanitariums and getting injected daily in their rears with testicular extracts from dogs, from roosters, from monkeys. By the 1920s, captains of industry, heads of state, famous religious leaders, all were doing it, and reporting wondrous results. Not because the science was accurate, but because if you're paying a fortune for painful daily injections of extract of dog's testicle, there's a certain incentive to decide you feel like a young bull. One big placebo effect. In most dissonant situations, there is more than one way to reduce dissonance. In the initiation experiment, for example, the women convinced themselves that the group was interesting. Is this the only way they could have reduced dissonance? No. Another way of making sense of the effort we've expended is to revise our memory of the past, that is, to misremember what things were like before we suffered or worked hard. In an experiment by Michael Conway and Michael Ross, 55, one group of students participated in a study skills course that promised more than it delivered. Another group of students signed up but did not participate. Whether or not they took the course, all students were asked to evaluate their study skills. After 3 weeks of useless training, the students wanted to believe that their skills had improved, but the objective data showed that they had not. They were still doing just as poorly in their coursework. How could they reduce dissonance between "I worked hard to improve" and "I didn't"? This was done by misremembering how bad their skills were before they took the course and underestimating the skills they had before they enrolled. Students who signed up but did not participate showed no such self-justifying behavior. Their recollections of earlier self-evaluations were accurate. This study may explain why people who spend time and money to get in shape may feel satisfied even if they don't fully succeed. They may not be able to convince themselves that they reached their goals, but they can overestimate the progress they did make by distorting their memories of how out of shape they were before they went into training. Conway and Ross call this self-justifying technique getting what you want by revising what you had. The justification of cruelty. I have repeatedly made the point that we need to convince ourselves that we are decent, reasonable people. Now suppose you did something that seriously, unambiguously harmed an innocent person. You posted a rumor about a friend that turned out to be untrue, or you texted your romantic partner a spontaneous but nasty insult. Your cognition, "I am a good person," would be dissonant with your cognition, "I've hurt another person." If the harm is obvious, then you cannot reduce the dissonance by changing your opinion of what happened and blithely telling yourself that you've done no harm. In this situation, the most effective way to reduce dissonance would be to maximize the culpability of the victim of your action, by telling yourself that the victim deserved what he or she got, either because he did something to bring it on himself or because she was a bad person. This mechanism might operate even if you did not directly harm the victim but disliked the person and were hoping that harm would befall him. For example, during a peaceful protest march in 1970 against the Vietnam War, a war that was creating as deep a political and cultural polarization across the country as we see today, 4 students at Kent State University were shot and killed by members of the Ohio National Guard. 9 others were wounded and 1 paralyzed for life. Quickly, rumors spread. Even before there was Twitter, the slain women were pregnant, the dead students were crawling with lice, the victims were so ridden with syphilis that they would have been dead in 2 weeks anyway, and so on. These rumors were preposterous and totally untrue. Why were the townspeople so eager to believe and spread them? It is impossible to know for sure, but my guess is that it was for reasons similar to the reasons rumors spread among the people in Indian towns following the earthquake. The rumors were comforting. Picture the situation. Kent is a conservative small town in Ohio. Many of the townspeople were infuriated by the radical behavior of some of the students. Some were probably hoping the students would get their comeuppance, but death was more than they deserved. In such circumstances, any information that put the victims in a bad light helped to reduce dissonance by implying that it was, in fact, a good thing that they died, or at least an inevitable thing, considering how sinful and diseased they all were. Several members of the Ohio National Guard stoutly maintained that the protesters deserved to die, and a local high school teacher went so far as to state that anyone who appears on the streets of a city like Kent with long hair, dirty clothes, or barefooted deserves to be shot. That opinion, she added, applied even to her own children. 56. Although few people were as extreme in their condemnation of the victims as the high school teacher, just about everyone can be influenced, under certain conditions, to justify cruelty committed against innocent victims. That's why it is essential for the social psychologist to step back from the helter-skelter of the real world and test predictions in the more controlled world of the experimental laboratory. Ideally, if we want to measure attitude change as a result of dissonance, we should know what the attitudes were before the dissonance-arousing event occurred. Such a situation was produced in an experiment conducted by Keith Davis and Edward Jones. 57 They asked students, one at a time, to watch a young man being interviewed and then describe their general opinions of him. Next, the students were instructed to provide the confederate with a prearranged analysis of his shortcomings as a human being. After telling him things they knew were certain to hurt him, that they thought he was shallow, untrustworthy, and boring, they convinced themselves that he deserved to be insulted this way. Why? He really was shallow and boring. Their opinion of him had become much more negative than it was prior to saying the hurtful things to him directly. This shift in views of their victim occurred even though all participants were aware that the other student had done nothing to merit their criticism and that they were just responding to the experimenter's instructions. An experiment by David Glass 58 had a similar result. In this study, when induced to deliver a series of electric shocks to other people, individuals who considered themselves good and decent people denigrated their victims as a result of having caused them this pain. This result was strongest among people with high self-esteem. If I'm just a person with low self-esteem who believes I'm always hurting other people's feelings, then causing others to suffer does not introduce much dissonance. Therefore, I have little need to convince myself that they deserved it. Here's the irony. It is precisely because I think I am such a nice person that, if I do something that causes you pain, I must convince myself you are a rat. Because nice guys like me don't go around hurting innocent people, you must have deserved every nasty thing I did to you. One condition, however, limits the justification of cruelty, the capacity of the victim to retaliate. If the victim is able and willing to retaliate at some future time, then a harm-doer feels that equity will be restored and thus has no need to justify the action by denigrating the victim. In an experiment by Ellen Burschett and her associates, 59 college students volunteered for an experiment in which each of them delivered a painful electric shock to a fellow student. As expected, each participant belittled the victim as a result of having delivered the shock. But half the students were told there would be a turnabout, that is, the other students would be given the opportunity to shock them. Those who were led to believe their victims would be able to retaliate had less dissonance to reduce, and hence had no need to belittle their victims to convince themselves that the victims deserved it. This research has serious implications. It shows that people do not perform acts of cruelty and come out unscathed. When we are engaged in a war in which, through our actions, many innocent people are being killed, we might try to blame the victims to justify our complicity, especially civilian victims who can't retaliate. A sad, though universal, phenomenon is that all cultures are inclined to dehumanize their enemies by calling them cruel names and regarding them as vermin, animals, brutes, and other non-human creatures. During World War II, Americans called the Japanese Japs and portrayed them as sneaky and diabolical. During the Vietnam War, American soldiers referred to the Vietnamese as gooks during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. American soldiers began referring to the enemy as ragheads because of the turbans or other headdresses that many Arabs and Muslims wear. The use of such language is a way of reducing dissonance. I am a good person, but we are fighting and killing these other people, therefore, they must deserve whatever they get, because they aren't fully human like us. But once we have succeeded in doing that, watch out, because dehumanization makes it easier to hurt and kill subhumans than to hurt and kill fellow human beings. Thus, reducing dissonance in this way increases the likelihood that the atrocities we are willing to commit now will justify our committing more of them over time. 60. Dehumanize. The process of seeing victims as non-humans, which lowers inhibitions against aggressive actions, and also makes continued aggression easier and more likely. People often justify other acts, besides the violence of warfare, that can feed hostility and discrimination. Just to take a wild example, imagine you live in a society in which poor children, many of whom are blacks and Latinos, have been blocked from attending first-rate public schools. Instead, they have been given a second-rate and often stultifying education. As a consequence, these children become less educated and less motivated than middle and upper-class white children, ending up doing poorly on achievement tests. Such a situation provides a golden opportunity for civic leaders to justify the status quo and, hence, to reduce dissonance. You see, they might say, those kids are stupid and unteachable. See how clever we were when we decided against wasting our hard-earned tax dollars, trying to provide them with a high-quality education. This self-fulfilling prophecy provides a perfect justification for further neglect of those less advantaged. John Jost and his colleagues 61 have studied this phenomenon, which they call system justification. Many people who were born into the highest levels of society, who have the greatest wealth and power, justify that position by believing they are entitled to it by virtue of their superior abilities and native talent. Whereas all those poor and struggling people are just too unable or unmotivated to succeed. As the football coach Barry Switzer once said, some people are born on third base and go through life thinking they hit a triple. In the final analysis, as I keep repeating, people are accountable for their own actions. Not everyone dehumanizes their opponents, or people who are economically worse off than they, or even their nation's enemies. But dissonance theory identifies the mechanism at the heart of dehumanization, the reason so many people resort to it to preserve their opinion of themselves as right, moral, and good. There is good news in this research. Because dehumanization is rooted in a desire to feel better about ourselves in the face of misfortunes of others, expressing our negative feelings, disgust, sorrow, shock, terror, that the victim's plight inspires eliminates our need to dehumanize them. Consider an experiment conducted by Kent Harbour and his associates. 62 participants watched a disturbingly violent and graphic bar scene from The Accused, in which a young woman called Sarah flirts and dances with one of the men, who becomes more aggressive in sexually groping her. She tries to stop him, with increasing fear, but he pins her down and rapes her. Other bar patrons join the assault, as she struggles desperately against them. The scene clearly portrays Sarah as an unwilling victim, but it also shows her drinking heavily, wearing revealing clothing, and dancing provocatively. Nothing she does remotely justifies the brutality of what is done to her, but for viewers inclined to blame the victim, her dress and actions give them ammunition. Afterward, participants were asked to write their evaluation of what they had seen. The suppression group was instructed to suppress their feelings and write only about factual details, such as what people were wearing. Participants in the disclosure group were told to freely express their deepest thoughts and feelings about their assigned movie. A week later, everyone evaluated Sarah. Had she shown bad judgment? Could she have done more for herself? Was she sympathetic and likable? Was she irresponsible? Was she moral? Was she someone participants could identify with? Had she brought her difficulties on herself? The answers were combined into a measure of blaming. The more distress the viewers acknowledged and expressed, the less they blamed the victim. In contrast, those instructed to suppress their emotions blamed Sarah more readily. Victim blaming, it would appear, is rooted in our need to justify ourselves and our attitudes toward those less fortunate, or who are victims of crime, poverty, or tragic events. Remarkably, it can sometimes be avoided by recognizing and expressing our own distress and human feelings, before it turns into something more unsavory. The psychology of inevitability. George Bernard Shaw was hard hit by his father's alcoholism, but he tried to make light of it. He once wrote, "If you cannot get rid of the family skeleton, you may as well make it dance." 63. In a sense, dissonance theory describes the ways people have of making their skeletons dance, of trying to make the best of unpleasant outcomes. This is particularly true when a situation arises that is both negative and inevitable. And what situation is more negative and inevitable for little kids than having to eat vegetables they hate? In one experiment, Jack Brems 64 got children to volunteer to eat a vegetable they had previously said they disliked a lot. Afterward, he led half the children to believe they could expect to eat much more of that vegetable in the future. The remaining children were not so informed. The children who were led to believe it was inevitable that they would be eating the vegetable in the future succeeded in convincing themselves that the vegetable was not so bad. In short, the cognition, "I dislike that vegetable," is dissonant with the cognition, "I will be eating that vegetable in the future." To reduce the dissonance, the children came to believe the vegetable was really not as noxious as they had previously thought. John Darley and Ellen Burschett 65 showed that the same phenomenon works with people as well as vegetables. In their experiment, college women volunteered to participate in a series of meetings in which each student would be discussing her sexual behavior and sexual standards with a woman she didn't know. Before beginning these discussions, each participant was given 2 folders. Each folder contained a personality description of a young woman who had supposedly volunteered for the same experience. The descriptions contained a mixture of pleasant and unpleasant characteristics. Half of the participants were led to believe they were going to interact with the young woman described in folder A, and the remaining participants were led to believe they were going to interact with the one described in folder B. Before meeting these women, the participants were asked to evaluate each of them on the basis of the personality descriptions they had read. Those who felt it was inevitable that they were going to share their intimate secrets with the young woman described in folder A found her much more appealing than the one described in folder B, whereas those who believed they had to interact with the young woman described in folder B found her much more appealing. The knowledge that one is inevitably going to be spending time with another person enhances the positive aspects of that person, or at least de-emphasizes his or her negative aspects. People tend to make the best of something they know is bound to happen. Just as with vegetables, inevitability makes the heart grow fonder. De-emphasizing the negative is an adaptive strategy when what's in store is a disliked vegetable or meeting a new person, but sometimes such a strategy can prove disastrous. People who live on the West Coast, especially Californians, for example, know that one of these days a big earthquake will hit. Rational people would no doubt acknowledge the danger and work to prepare by learning all they can about it and by taking safety precautions, right? Nope. Even among well-educated people, a typical response to an inevitable catastrophe is to do nothing to prepare for it. Darren Lehman and Shelley Taylor 66 interviewed 120 undergraduates from UCLA and found that, although they all knew about the earthquake threat, only 5% had taken any safety precautions. Only 1/3 knew that the best action to take during a quake is to crawl under a desk or other heavy piece of furniture, and not one respondent had taken preparatory measures recommended by experts. Coping styles, however, varied as a function of the student's living situation. Students living in seismically unsafe residence halls were more likely than those living in relatively safe residence halls to cope with the impending disaster by refusing to think about it or by minimizing the expected damage. But if you're pretty sure that there's going to be an earthquake, how can you justify continuing to live in an unsafe residence hall? Easy, you deny that there's ever going to be an earthquake and refuse to think about it. Self-justifying responses to dangerous and inevitable events can be comforting in the short run. But when they keep us from taking steps to enhance our safety, such responses can, in the long run, prove deadly. Perhaps you have noticed the curious difference between the responses of children facing a disliked vegetable or college students facing an inevitable interaction with another person, on the one hand, and the responses of UCLA students to the threat of an impending earthquake, on the other hand. In the former situations, people accept the inevitable and embrace attitudes stressing the positive aspects of the unavoidable event. The latter situation, however, involves confronting a highly probable event that is life-threatening and largely uncontrollable. It would be stretching the limits of the human imagination to redefine a major earthquake as desirable, or as anything less than a catastrophe. And we can't prevent earthquakes. The best we can hope for is to respond adaptively to one, with no guarantee that safety measures will really save us. Thus, the nature of our response may depend on whether we believe preventive steps will genuinely increase our sense of control over the inevitable. If such steps seem futile, then the prospect of expending effort will only serve to increase our feeling of dissonance even further. Under such circumstances, we are likely to justify not taking safety measures by denying the probability of the potential disaster or vastly underestimating its magnitude. Can you see where this is going? Scientists have reached an international consensus that global warming poses a major threat to the planet, yet many Americans remain unconcerned by it or think climate change is a hoax. Dissonance theory suggests that if scientists want to motivate people into taking immediate action on global warming, it will be vital to also convince them that doing something about it is within their control. Simply stoking up their fears is likely to make them either deny its existence or actively disregard the scientific evidence. Practical applications of dissonance theory. One of the reasons the theory of cognitive dissonance has attracted enormous interest and inspired so much research is its ability to explain and predict people's behavior that defies common sense. Moreover, dissonance theory accounts for many phenomena, ranging from how rumors are spread to how people change their attitudes and behaviors, from practicing safer sex to the reduction of racial prejudice. Beyond its power to help us understand and predict, a theory is of particular value if it can be practically applied in ways that benefit people. I turn now to some notable applications of the theory. Condoms and conservation. As we saw in the case of earthquake preparedness, one way of remaining oblivious to dissonance is by steadfastly refusing to pay close attention to what we are doing. In the 1980s, nearly 17,000 Americans died in the AIDS epidemic, and hundreds of millions of dollars were spent on AIDS prevention campaigns in the mass media. Although these campaigns were reasonably effective in conveying information about how the disease was transmitted and the importance of condoms for safe sex, they were not nearly as successful in preventing people from engaging in risky sexual behavior. Sexually active college men were aware that AIDS was a serious problem, but only a small percentage used condoms regularly. When asked to explain why, they offered the familiar reasons: condoms were inconvenient, unromantic, and reminded them of disease. Thus, as researchers have consistently discovered, people will delude themselves, in this case, believing that, while AIDS is a serious problem, they themselves are not at risk. 67 If the mass media have been ineffective, is there anything that can be done to shake people out of their denial? During the height of the AIDS epidemic, my students and I developed a method for convincing men to use condoms by using a variation of the saying is believing paradigm discussed earlier. In the typical saying is believing experiment, individuals are asked to make a speech advocating a point of view that runs counter to their own opinion. This arouses dissonance. Dissonance is then reduced by changing their attitude to bring it more into line with their speech. I wondered how this paradigm could be applied to the AIDS epidemic. As a researcher, here is the problem I faced. When it came to practicing safe sex, almost everybody knew what they should do, but hardly anyone wanted to do it. So how do you get men to experience dissonance by making an argument favoring the use of condoms when they already believe that using condoms is a good idea? It's a dilemma. And then we hit upon a solution. Because men were insulating themselves from dissonance via the mechanism of denial, the experimenters would cut through this denial by confronting them with their own hypocrisy. This method was so successful that it came to be called the hypocrisy paradigm. It rests on the fact that almost all of us are on a personal quest for integrity. We began by asking college students to compose a speech describing the dangers of AIDS and advocating the use of condoms. Every single time you have sex, 68 every student was more than willing to do it, because every one of them believed it was a good idea for sexually active men to use condoms. In one condition, the students merely composed the arguments. In another condition, after composing the arguments, the students were asked to record their argument on a videotape that would be played to an audience of high school students as part of a sex education class. Prior to making the speech, half of the students in each condition were made mindful of their own past failures to use condoms by making a list of the circumstances in their own lives when they found it particularly difficult, awkward, or impossible to use condoms. Essentially, then, the participants who made a video for high school students, after having been made mindful of their own reluctance to use condoms, were in a state of high dissonance. We had made them aware of their own hypocrisy in preaching behavior to high school students that they themselves were not practicing. To avoid feeling like hypocrites and maintain their self-esteem, they would need to start practicing what they were preaching. And that is exactly what we found. Students in the hypocrisy condition were far more likely to purchase condoms than in any of the other conditions. Furthermore, several months later, a large proportion of the students in this condition reported that they were using condoms regularly. The hypocrisy paradigm has been used to attack other problems as well, such as the problem of water conservation. Women in public shower rooms at the University of California were approached and asked to sign a petition and lend their name to the effort of persuading people to take short showers. After signing the petition, their name was pasted onto a sign that read, take short showers. If I can do it, so can you. After adding their name to the sign, some of the students were asked to think of all the times they had failed in the past month to take short showers, which highlighted the dissonance between their preaching and their practicing. Later these women were observed and timed in the shower room. Those who had been made mindful of their hypocrisy took significantly shorter showers. This kind of self-persuasion technique can be used whenever we would like to get people to do more of what they already agree is a good thing to do, such as exercising, studying, recycling, using sunscreen, you name it. Point 69. Shedding light on the power of cult leaders' dissonance theory has shown itself to be useful as a way of increasing our understanding of events that totally confound our imagination.